Hello, Patreon peeps. It's Paul the Ripples guy. We're tuning in live with about 25 people, and we're going to explore hope today. I'm so excited. We'll start with some centering, and I want to share two things with you that I used to hear every Tuesday morning at 9:30 when I sat down in Loretta's office, my therapist. When I shortly after I moved to Cincinnati, I found Loretta and saw her for 5 years. She's an awesome person. And she started early on in our time together. She goes, I want to read this to you. Let me know if you like this. And I liked it so much, I said every week. And I'm going to invite you to take a couple here now breaths. And if you'd like to close your eyes while I read this, it takes about 60 seconds. And it's called Just for Now. Just for now, and without asking how, let yourself sink into stillness. Just for now, lay down the weight you so patiently bear upon your shoulders. Feel the earth receive you, and the infinite expanse of sky grow even wider as your awareness reaches up to meet it. Just for now, allow a wave of breath to enliven your experience. Breathe out whatever blocks you from the truth. Just for now, be boundless, free, awakened energy tingling in your hands and feet. Drink in the possibility of being who and what you really are, so fully alive that when you open your eyes, the world looks different, newly born and vibrant. Just for now. And that was written by Dana Falds. And this other quote you've heard me talk about in several of my presentations. It's often sourced to Viktor Frankl. It's actually a quote that is in Stephen Covey's book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He's not claiming credit for it. He says he saw it in a book in a library in Hawaii, and we've never been able to figure out who really said it. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. And with that, I want to dive into our PEBBLE. Actually, I'm going to go out of order today because it makes more sense if I jump right to the boulder, which is an activity that I sometimes pocket from presentations content that I'm exploring, sometimes from my personal activity or my personal life. This one just came to me this week when a Rippler, I've been a new student at UNC Asheville, I've been trading message with, made a reference to a term called a replacement thought. And he told me this technique his therapist taught him. And I'd never heard that term. And I Googled it and I fell into a rabbit hole of Googling and learning. And it ended up that I needed to teach me and you something called stop. And I need to find my share screen and share with you my messy, messy desktop. And underneath all these piles of things, somewhere is my. Now, if a couple of you, are you seeing one image or two images up there on the screen? Okay, good. Sometimes it switches out and it shows you my preview screen. I'm like, no, that's just for Paul. This is a slide I borrowed. I dug into my archives of presentation content so that I could really quickly set up something called the cognitive behavioral triangle, or it's called different things. But it's something I use in on some of my presentations to talk about the fact that our feelings affect our thoughts and affect their behavior. And when people dive in to go get help from a counselor or a coach, there's basically 3 different ways to attach because of the fact that our thoughts affect our feelings, affect our behavior. Different approaches to coaching and counseling and therapy dive in at different points. And a lot of people think of counseling as tell me what you're feeling, tell me how that's affecting your feelings. And you start with your feelings and that affects your thinking and your behavior. Cognitive behavior therapy takes an approach of saying, let's take a look at how your thinking might be the easier way in and or your behavior. And different strokes work for different folks and different challenges work better with different approaches. Well, when I started reading about replacement thoughts, I learned that how this one place in particular summarized cognitive behavioral therapy using the acronym STOP. And it's funny that I started making this cute little sign. And then when I came into my desk this morning, it wasn't colored in red like I visualized it. And I had worked so hard to make sure it would be ready. And I really quickly colored it and I was all beating myself up. And then I opened my slides and remembered, oh yeah, I decided to make a slide instead. Oh, Wesselman. When you find yourself having in a swirl of thoughts or you're particularly overwhelmed, feeling despondent, this acronym reminds us to stop first, take a breath, and observe what you're thinking. And where did I put my little notes? Oh, here, there. What thoughts are going through your mind right now? What is your focus of attention? What are you reacting to? What sensations do you notice in your body? Just observing. And the idea is that quote that I shared earlier, the between stimulus and response is a space. And basically what STOP is trying to do is to expand that space and turn it into a chance for you to observe and maybe choose mindfully how to respond. So the next thing is to pull back and get some perspective. And the questions, I'll put a link here when I get done what I'm reading. And asking yourself, what's the bigger picture? What's the helicopter view? Is there another way to look at this situation? If a friend was in this situation, what would you tell them? Or if you stopped and asked a friend, what do you think they would tell you might be a way to have a different thought? Is there a more reasonable explanation than the one that I've jumped to now? How important is it? How important will this be in a few months? So just some ways to reframe the thought and then to practice what works, to proceed, to jump back in. What is the best thing to do right now instead of what was the first instinct that I had? And stop share. And so that is the STOPP that I thought would be useful for you to know about. I will hop over here to my notes of links. I hear myself making the sounds because I have to act everything out. What was that comedian? I remember him from Sesame Street that we used to do he would
like
do
Victor Borgia.
Thank you, Victor Borgia. Would make sounds of different punctuation marks as he read, and how bizarre. Just thought of that. Thank you, whoever. Bonus points. It's whoever that was gets trivia bonus points. Quickly before we dive into our topic, the resource that I wanted to share with you is a children's book that was sent to me about, over a year ago when my mom passed away. And it came without anything inscribed and a little note that said, I thought you might like this if you want to pass it on when you're done with it. And I did not open it and read it at the time. And in a very fascinating coincidence, a few months later, one of my dear, dear aunts passed away. And it was expected. She was ill. And when I got the call that she had passed, I crumpled in my chair and started crying. And I instinctively grabbed this book. And it's still a mystery to me why I chose it, because I had forgotten about it. And it's a book that's targeted towards children and helps talk about where people go after they die. And I'm just going to read two lines, the first two lines. It's so beautiful. And it says, the next place that I go will be as peaceful and familiar as a sleepy summer Sunday and a sweet, untroubled mind. And yet it won't be anything like any place I've ever been or seen or even dreamed of, in the place I leave behind. The reason I'm sharing with it today is I thought it was a remarkable example of reframing things that we're going to be talking about today. And it also became relevant because I have had to send out 2 copies of the book to 2 different people who just lost people that they cared about. And so it was sitting on my desk and I had a different resource I was going to share. And I said, you know what? Somebody else might need to know about that today. Hope is our topic, and I want to give hope its due. The challenge for me that made this so exciting for me personally is that back in when this Ripples of Hope first came out, and if you don't know, I had started writing a book on hope in late 2016 and most of 2017, because I knew a lot of people that were really struggling with, where is our country going? Where is the planet going? I'm scared, I'm overwhelmed. And I was convinced that I could help by pulling together all the information that I had been either using over the years or that I had written to other people when they had reached out to me with big challenges, big changes, or with a lot of uncertainty in their life. And I had gotten stuck over and over and had set aside this huge pile of materials and content. And then when COVID happened, we did the sticker thing, the "we got this," and that was still running its course. And I woke up one morning and I knew what we needed was hope. And so I sat down with Jamie, my partner who worked in publishing for many years, and he looked at everything I'd written and he said, you don't need to write probably another word. You've got what we need in here. And he helped edit it. And we turned it into this fabulous book. Very soon afterwards, one of my childhood friends and one of our Patreon peeps, Jill, and I were talking about this, and she said, you need to do a course on learning hope. And I was fascinated by the title and very intrigued, and it's been brewing. Well, I found a couple articles in the last month or so and had them on my list. And I wanted to read them and start diving into this, and I needed a deadline. And so you all became my deadline. And this dump of thoughts is leading us towards, can you learn hope? And if so, how can we learn hope? And this is a very rough sketch of the process that I went from having already written a book about hope and then deciding, can you learn hope? And I'm going to go back to my slides now, because the obvious first place to start is that it's really important that we know what we're talking about. And so it starts with the definitions. And it says participants can now see my screen, so I'll take that as a good sign. So I'm just in a very few number of minutes here, I'm going to skate through a bunch of blah, 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 so that I can just show you my thinking. I started with the Merriam-Webster definition of hope as a desire with expectation of obtainment or fulfillment. So even the very basic definition of hope implies this idea that there is an expectation that something good. It's more than just wishing for something to happen. It's this idea, there's some level of belief that it can happen. When you start getting into what researchers, what psychologists, what sociologists started thinking about hope, Erik Erikson, some of you might recognize that name. I remember studying him in child development and psychology undergrad. He had my favorite definition of hope of all the pages and pages of definitions I was looking at: an enduring belief in the attainability of fervent wishes. When do you get to use the word fervent? And enduring belief, people who have hope tend to not only have this idea of something that they want out there, but they also believe it can come into fruition. And this is where we get into where these two researchers that are at the cornerstone of the I was not talking to you, Siri, but oh my gosh, Siri just gave me a whole bunch of results about the definition of hope. Stop listening, Siri. Shane Lopez is one of the people who really dive in and said, how can we research study hope and hopefully help expand hope in individuals and groups? And he defined hope as the belief that the future can be better and the belief that I can set a course to make that better. And so, or to make that happen. And this is where we start to really see the idea that hope has a couple components. And this last definition here is the one that turned into the research instrument that some of you helped me take that we're going to talk about. And what was really fascinating to me in this research is that it's less about the emotion of hope, and it's much more about a cognitive state that's based on a sense of agency, the idea that you have power to get something done, and a pathway. You have a sense of how to go get something that you want. And Eric Barker, who writes a popular blog called Barking Up the Tree, I think is the name of his blog, and he does lots of summaries of books, both academic research and pop culture books. And I really liked how he summarized hope as goals plus agency, the belief that you can get it, and the pathway, how you get that. How Rick Snyder and Shane Lopez and a lot of people that look at hope, they kind of assume in the agency that you have a sense of what you want. But I think it makes sense to say that there's really three. And I added a fourth component because as I looked at all the research and as I looked at the conclusion people were reaching, I was seeing four things if I was going to do a workshop on learning hope. That there is a wanting phase, a planning phase, a pursuing phase, and a persevering through difficulty phase. And if I'm going to bring that to this next slide here, if I take it back to this slide that I added, and it's so funny because I just added this morning, and then it turned out this was going to help me crystallize my thinking. If we tried to take this CBT triangle and thought of it as a triangle of hope, that the feelings piece over here is where we look at hope as a want, as a desire. And that might be a place that we start if somebody is feeling low in hope, that we start with what are things that you used to want, or what are things that if you felt confident you could get them, what are the things that you would like to be able to do, to get, to have, to see, whatever. And the cognitive process starts coming in when we say, okay, how are we going to get there? What are the steps that we need to do in order to get there? And then the behavior is actually pursuing it. What are the things you can do? And this is what I like, that hope is a verb. It is an action that we can put into play. And I was torn. I kind of gave up on this of deciding where I thought perseverance, because I thought really perseverance, grit, requires all of these in order to have happen, because part of baked into the research on hope is the idea that high hopers, people who score well on these instruments they've developed, not only is hope having a sense that you can do something and a pathway to get it, it's being able to persevere even when there's the inevitable obstacles that come up. And for me, that is worth pulling out as a separate thing. And again, what fascinated me, and I fell into a little wormhole when I stumbled upon these research instruments, is very short questionnaires that measure hope by looking specifically at agency thinking. So how strongly do you believe that you have the oomph to go get something? And then the pathways, do you have a sense of how that you would go and get the things that you want? And I made up the term the A scale and the P scale because I thought that sounded fun. And if the 12 questions that were on the survey, 4 of them were actually throwaway questions which is somewhat common in research, to be able to test the validity of the study and to make sure people aren't just going through and do. They throw in some questions that if you really were scoring high on these things, you would have to go over and score the throwaway questions low, or something isn't quite adding up right. So For agency thinking, the ability to initiate and sustain motivation for action, there were 4 questions that were on the survey, and I'm just going to put them up here. I energetically pursue my goals. My past experiences have prepared me well for my future. I've been pretty successful in life. I meet the goals I set for myself. So you scored this on an 8-point scale, and then you basically can get 4 points if you scored the lowest, and 32 points if you scored the highest, if you add all 4 of these results together. And as a sense of how high your agency thinking is. And then the other 4 is the pathways thinking. Capacity to develop strategies, specific strategies for goal achievement. And when you look at the questions, it totally makes sense. These are, I can't think of many ways to get out. I can think of many ways to get out of a jam. There are lots of ways around any problem. I can think of many ways to get to the things in life that are important to me. And even when others get discouraged, I know how I can find a way to solve a problem. So you'll see in how researchers look at this, they tend to put planning and persevering in the same bucket. And that makes sense to me. I think if you're trying to teach hope, or if you're trying to learn hope, I think it's worth looking at those as slightly different pieces. And hey, listen, if this is really fascinating to you and you're geeking out on this, I can totally get you these slides, of course. I'll post them when I post the video. And I'm just going to speed through this list because I fell into this fascinating thing. There is tons of research suggesting that people that are high hopers tolerate pain better. They have higher levels of well-being after difficulty. They've measured groups of, somebody close to you dies, you get a cancer diagnosis, you get these big things that happen. People who score as high hopers tend to bounce back to well-being faster. They tend to think more creatively and more flexibly. They recognize the silver linings. They perform better academically. They're less prone to loneliness, and they're less likely to succumb to helplessness and despair. What's interesting is the people who coined the phrase learned helplessness have really have evolved their thinking and the research over the last 30 years, and now see hope as the antidote to learned helplessness. And that was another rabbit hole that just really fascinated me. High hopers tend to have a greater number of goals. They have more difficult goals. They have more success in their goals. They report being happier and have less stress. They have coping skills that are higher. They recover better from physical injury. So this is, again, the psychological, physical pain and healing loop that we tend to separate out, which is, of course, so linked. They report less burnout. And then this was fascinating to me. High hope correlates with high grades, but not with high IQ. So as an interesting, it's a better predictor of academic achievement than IQ. And again, I think that's fascinating because what the research is showing over and over again, that hope is much more like a skill that you can learn. They call it a trait, but like so many other traits that we used to think of as fixed in personality, and so many, when I was in college in the late 80s and in grad school, 89 to 91, a lot of the things we learned about stage theory development was that you were first here, and then you're here, and then you're here, and then you're done. And after age X, depending on what the trait is, after age X, you mostly don't change. Even Myers-Briggs stuff, they tended to think of as pretty, this is the way it is. And so much research now and life experience has suggested that a lot of this is a lot more malleable. And it turns out that hope is malleable, and it is something that we can teach and people can learn if they want. And what happened for me after I did all this reading and sat back and took, dozens and dozens of pages of notes. One of the things that I'm only about 20 pages into a 300-page academic book that was going to cost me $160 to buy. Thank you, academic world. My best friend, who's a professor at Miami, brought it home in 24 hours. And listen to this academic privilege. The due date is July of 2022. So I'm pouring through this book, and really a lot of what I shared has come out of this book. But I went back to my little cute book on hope after reading all this research, and with the question of, how'd I do? How much would I need to redo if I was doing another version of this book, or if I wanted to turn this into a presentation? And while I would say that the chapters that I decided to put this in, I would rethink a lot of that, I was really excited by some of my instincts about things like being able to choose hope. And one of the really good things that came out of this research that supported something that I said in here many times is that you can actually choose to hope. And if you are willing to give it a try, it can actually strengthen your hope and create a cycle of feelings, thoughts, behaviors that's a loop. Last year, I ended up reading a couple anti-racism books, and this book, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, a very hard read, a very good read, and I read it with a couple people. And it's a personal journey of his parents and his story in life, in the racism they experienced and becoming anti-racist. And it also includes a pretty difficult journey of his with his physical illness, including a cancer diagnosis. And at one point, he was basically told that 7% of the people who have your stage of cancer live more than 6 months. And he makes, and this in the last pages of the book, he ends up comparing his cancer diagnosis and how dire that diagnosis was to how dire the diagnosis is for racism in our country and our culture and our planet. And he made a conscious decision to choose hope, in part, he says, because the alternative seemed a lot worse. Giving up hope just lowered his chances of surviving. And so he didn't necessarily have logic to go with it, but he said, I know I've got a better chance if I'm hopeful. And he's still alive today. And he has beat a lot of the odds around cancer. And his book has done some pretty remarkable things at starting conversations about racism. And while I think we have a long way to go for both of those things, it gave me hope. The other thing that was in this book a lot is about practicing hope and about thinking of ways that you can take baby steps here and there. And I recognize, looking at the book through the lens of feelings and thinking and behavior, that I am proud of the fact that me and the people who helped me make this book were touching on all these things very haphazardly. We were, all over the place. We weren't thinking of this as a structure. One line I read that I wrote: fear is often a subconscious reaction to hope, while hope is a conscious response. And the research actually says something a little bit different, but that if we feel there's a low probability of success, we're more likely to default to fear. And when we think there's a high probability of success, we're more likely to head towards hope. We talked about choosing hope and the importance of persistence. And when I asked you all when you were registering, is there anything that's really hard going on right now? So many of you talked about either exhaustion from how long the pandemic's been going on, or things that are just uncertain and it's hard to retain hope because things are so bad, either for you or for other people. And the ability to persevere, again, is a skill that we can work on. And finally, that action plays a role in this, that this triangle of hope, I'm calling this right now, involves us looking at our feelings, it involves us looking at our thoughts, and it also involves us looking at our behavior. That's 30 minutes of hope, and that's a lot of information to take in. But what I'd like to do here is tie a bow in it by saying this: hope is hard, hope is worth it. Hope is a feeling, hope is a way of thinking, and hope is a set of behaviors. And as somebody who's written a book on hope, I can tell you that hope came into being for me in the process of writing that book, and in the process of having the help that you all gave me in getting the book published so that so many people can hold hope in their hands. So with that, I'm going to, let's see if we can stop the share. And if, with your permission, I would like to remove the spotlight. You can secretly hide, if you're not feeling like a wave, you can kind of pause your camera for a little bit. I'm going to remove the recording, or the spotlight, so that I can turn it to gallery. And then I'm going to turn off the recording. And if you could do me a favor and wave goodbye to the good people who are watching the recording. Goodbye, everyone. That way